The hammer's pause. The steady sound of hammering filled the afternoon air, a rhythmic counterpoint to the chirping cicadas. Sarah leaned casually against her own fence, the warm wood rough against her bare arm, watching the 59-year-old neighbor patch up a crooked panel next door. His faded blue shirt, sleeves rolled up past sinewy forearms, clung lightly to his back. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, catching the sunlight before disappearing into his silver hair. His focus was absolute, the gentle tap-tap-tap of his hammer a testament to his methodical nature. When he finally paused, stepping back to eye his work, he noticed her gaze. A polite nod, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, was his only acknowledgement. But Sarah didn't move. Instead, a slow, knowing smirk played on her lips. "Looks good," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the short distance. "But I just turned 18, maybe you should fix mine next." The hammer stilled midair, a dark, heavy silhouette against the bright sky. His eyes, the color of deep sea, met hers across the fence line. The silence stretched, heavier than the humid summer air, filled with a flirty tension that made even the simple backyard feel like the center of something much bigger. A faint blush crept up his neck, contrasting with the sun-darkened skin of his face. His grip on the hammer remained firm, but the movement was arrested, his entire posture frozen in a tableau of unexpected confrontation. "Congratulations, Sarah," he finally said, his voice a low rumble, the words clipped and even. He didn't drop his gaze, but a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. 18 is a significant age. He lowered the hammer slowly, deliberately, resting its head on the top of the fence post. It was a gesture of truce, perhaps, or a strategic withdrawal. "Your fence looks perfectly sound to me." Sarah pushed off the fence, taking a step closer, her smirk widening. The scent of jasmine from her mother's garden mingled with the faint, metallic tang of his tools. "Oh, it has its weaknesses," she purred, letting her eyes drift pointedly over the weathered planks. "Don't all old things eventually?" He finally broke eye contact, his gaze sweeping over his own, newly repaired fence panel, as if searching for a flaw. "Perhaps," he conceded, his voice almost a whisper, as if speaking to himself. "But sometimes a weakness isn't a flaw. It's just character." He turned fully then, leaning back against his fence, mirroring her earlier stance, though his posture was more rigid, less relaxed. He crossed his arms, the action pulling the fabric of his shirt taut across his chest. "What exactly needs fixing, Sarah?" She laughed, a bright, melodic sound that seemed to chase away the last vestiges of the heavy silence. "Oh, nothing urgent," she admitted, stepping back, a playful glint in her eyes. "Just thought it'd be a good excuse to chat." She watched him, assessing, enjoying the subtle shift in his composure. The casual ease he normally exuded was replaced by a taut awareness, a guardedness that was both frustrating and exhilarating. The moment hung, ripe with unspoken possibilities, the afternoon sun casting long, blurring shadows across the lawn. The hammer remained on the fence post, a silent sentinel, its pause amplifying the unsaid. A week to wait. The silence hung between them, thick with unspoken possibilities. Mr. Henderson, his face a careful mask, slowly lowered his hammer. "Your fence looks perfectly sound, Sarah," he said, his voice even, betraying nothing. He turned back to his own repair, the rhythm of his work returning, a deliberate counterpoint to the lingering tension. Sarah, however, didn't miss the subtle clenching of his jaw, the way his shoulders seemed to tense just a fraction. She pushed off the fence, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Just offering a helping hand, Mr. Henderson," she called out, then turned and walked inside, leaving him to the steady thud of wood on wood. Inside her quiet house, the phone felt heavy in her hand. She stared at the contact for Emily, her best friend, the one person she told everything. But this felt different. Too fragile, too new, too dangerous to share. She set the phone down, her gaze falling on the calendar pinned to the fridge. 7 days. 7 days until her mother returned from her conference, 7 days of absolute, unmonitored freedom. A week to wait, to let this simmering current between her and Mr. Henderson develop, or dissipate. The thought sent a thrill through her, a mixture of anticipation and a faint tremor of fear. The next few days were a dance of proximity and avoidance. Sarah found reasons to be in her backyard, tending to neglected rose bushes, reading a book in the dappled shade, even just lying on a blanket, soaking up the sun. Each time, she was acutely aware of the sounds from next door, the occasional rustle, a distant cough, the clinking of tools. Once, she heard him talking on the phone, his voice a low rumble, and she found herself straining to catch the words, a blush creeping up her neck at her own nosiness. He, in turn, seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. She'd catch glimpses of him through the gaps in the fence, a flash of his work shirt as he moved about his yard. He'd offer a polite wave if their eyes met, a quiet "good afternoon, Sarah." But he never lingered, never initiated conversation beyond the most cursory pleasantries. His reticence only fueled her curiosity, making the game more intriguing. Was he truly oblivious, or was he just playing along, waiting for her next move? On the fourth day, a small package arrived for Sarah. It was from her mother, an early birthday gift, a delicate silver necklace. As she was admiring it on the porch, Mr. Henderson walked by, heading to his mailbox. He paused, his gaze drawn to the glint of silver at her throat. "That's lovely, Sarah," he said, his voice softer than usual. "A special occasion?" "My mother likes to spoil me," she replied, letting her fingers trace the cool metal. "Just a little reminder of my newfound maturity." She met his eyes, a challenge in hers. His expression remained unreadable, but his gaze held hers for a beat longer than necessary. Then, with a curt nod, he retrieved his mail and disappeared into his own home. The encounter, brief as it was, left a tingling sensation in her veins. The week was half over. The silence between them was growing louder, charged with unspoken questions and simmering desires. Shared boards and stories. The aroma of grilling fish mingled with the salty air, a welcome scent after the day's work. Sarah and David sat on weathered wooden benches at an outdoor table, the last rays of sun painting the horizon in hues of orange and purple. David, his hands still calloused from the day's repairs, gestured towards the array of surfboards leaning against the shack. "So, you said you've never surfed before?" he asked, a hint of playful disbelief in his voice. Sarah took a sip of her iced tea, the condensation cool against her fingers. "Never. Grew up landlocked, remember? My idea of a big wave was a splash from a passing boat on the lake." She met his gaze, a challenge in her eyes. "But I'm a fast learner." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "I believe it. You pick things up quickly." His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. "All right then. Tomorrow morning, before the crowds. I'll teach you the basics. We'll find you a longboard, something stable." "Deal," she said, a thrill running through her. The idea of riding a wave, of moving with the ocean's power, was exhilarating. "But you'll have to tell me more about this place." She gestured vaguely at the small, bustling beach town. "And about you. You've lived here a long time?" David's smile softened. "Most of my life. My parents run a small guest house down the road. It's a quiet town, mostly. Good people." He took a bite of his grilled mahi-mahi. "You know, I once had a chance to leave. Headed to the city for a few years, tried the corporate life. But something always pulled me back. The ocean, I suppose. It gets in your blood." "I can see why," Sarah murmured, her gaze drawn to the rhythmic crash of waves on the shore. The city felt impossibly far away, a distant hum she barely remembered. "My parents, they always wanted me to pursue something academic. Law, medicine. But I always felt like there was something else out there for me. Something more real." A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated by the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of the ocean. The air grew cooler as darkness descended, and David reached over to light a small lantern on the table, casting a warm glow on their faces. "You know," David began, his voice a little softer now, you remind me a bit of myself when I was your age. That restless energy, that desire for something more. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the lantern flame. It's a good quality to have. Just make sure you know what you're looking for. Sarah felt a blush creep up her neck. His words, though gentle, held a weight she couldn't quite decipher. Was it a warning? A compliment? Or something else entirely? She met his gaze across the flickering light. I'm still figuring that out, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. But I think I'm getting closer. He held her gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. The night deepened, the stars beginning to prick through the inky sky, and Sarah felt a connection blooming between them, as steady and undeniable as the tide. Tomorrow, she would learn to surf. But tonight, she was learning something else entirely. The potluck invitation. The steady sound of hammering filled the afternoon air. Sarah leaned casually against her own fence, watching the 59-year-old neighbor patch up a crooked panel next door. His sleeves were rolled up, his focus entirely on the job. When he finally noticed her gaze, he gave a polite nod. But Sarah didn't move, instead, she smirked. Looks good, she called out. But I just turned 18, maybe you should fix mine next. The hammer stilled midair, his eyes meeting hers across the fence line. The silence stretched, heavier than the summer air, filled with a flirty tension that made even the simple backyard feel like the center of something much bigger. A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Is that an invitation, Miss Sarah? He asked, his voice a low rumble. It could be, she purred, pushing off the fence and taking a step closer, though still on her side. Or a suggestion. Depends on how you want to interpret it. He chuckled, a rich, warm sound that sent a little shiver down her spine. I'll interpret it as a suggestion for now. Give me a moment to finish this panel. He turned back to his work, but the ease had gone out of his movements. Sarah watched, a triumphant glint in her eyes, as he drove the last nail with more force than necessary. When he finally straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, he walked towards their shared fence line. The scent of sawdust and a faint, masculine musk reached her as he approached. So, your fence, huh, he mused, glancing at her sturdy, well-maintained panels. Looks pretty solid to me. Everything needs maintenance eventually, Sarah countered, letting her gaze linger on his arms, the muscles still defined beneath his work-worn shirt. Especially old things. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement dancing in his eyes. Are you implying something about me, young lady? Just stating a fact, she said innocently, though her eyes were anything but. Though, some old things are worth more effort to keep in good repair. She met his gaze directly, a challenge and an invitation swirling in her depths. The air vibrated between them, charged and electric. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it, a thoughtful expression on his face. Just then, a shrill, cheerful voice cut through the quiet. Arthur. Are you coming in? The casserole's almost ready. It was his wife, Martha, emerging from his back door, a floral apron tied around her waist. She spotted Sarah and offered a friendly, if slightly distant, wave. Arthur's shoulders seemed to relax, the tension that had held them taut visibly dissipating. He gave Sarah a polite, almost formal nod. Looks like duty calls. Martha's famous chicken surprise. He paused, then added, Say, Sarah, Martha's organizing a neighborhood potluck next Saturday. Just a casual get-together. You should come. Sarah's triumphant smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Martha's timing was impeccable, as always. A potluck, she repeated, the words tasting flat. Yes, everyone brings a dish. It's always a good time, Arthur said, a genuine smile now adorning his face, completely devoid of the earlier spark. Martha mentioned she'd drop by with an official invitation later this week. Martha, oblivious to the undercurrents, chimed in, Yes, darling, I'll write it out tonight. We'd love to have you, Sarah. Sarah forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That sounds lovely. I'll think about it. As Arthur turned to follow his wife indoors, the back door closing with a soft click, Sarah was left alone, the scent of sawdust replaced by the faint, cloying smell of Martha's casserole wafting over the fence. The easy confidence she'd felt minutes ago had evaporated, leaving behind a simmering frustration. A potluck. With Martha. This was not the kind of invitation she'd been hoping for. Whispers and worries. The westering sun, now a low-slung orb, stretched long shadows across the freshly mended fence. Sarah observed Mr. Henderson dab his brow with a gloved hand, his earlier polite nod now supplanted by a hesitant, almost troubled mien. The hammer, a forgotten sentinel, rested on the lawn beside him. "You know, Sarah," he began, his voice a gravelly murmur, "you're a bright girl. And attractive, too." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, devoid of its usual flirtatious sparkle, imbued instead with a different, starker intensity. "But certain things, certain boundaries shouldn't be breached. For your own well-being." Sarah's playful smirk wavered. The light-hearted current between them had dissipated, replaced by a strange disquiet. "What are you talking about?" she retorted, her voice sharper than intended. Their easy repartee had curdled. He sighed, idly twirling a stray wood shaving between calloused fingers. "Just a premonition. People talk, you see. And sometimes, what they discuss isn't kind. Especially when it concerns a young woman and an older man." He finally met her eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, regret. A caution, in their depths. A chill tightened in Sarah's gut. She pictured her mother, the knowing glances her aunts sometimes exchanged. The allure of the illicit had always been intoxicating, but now a shiver snaked its way up her spine. "I don't care what people say," she declared, though the conviction felt hollow even to her own ears. Mr. Henderson simply shook his head, a weary resignation settling upon his features. "You might, one day. Exercise caution, Sarah. That's all I'm suggesting." He gathered his tools with a decisiveness that brooked no further discussion, the effortless rapport between them abruptly severed. The late afternoon breeze, which had felt balmy moments ago, now seemed to murmur a warning. Later that evening, the intimations began. Not audible whispers, but the kind that vibrate in the atmosphere, carried on the subtle inflections in her mother's voice, the brief, pointed silences at the dinner table. Sarah poked at her lasagna, acutely conscious of her mother, Eleanor, watching her. "Anything noteworthy happened today, dear?" Eleanor inquired, her tone carefully neutral, indeed, too neutral. Sarah shrugged. Mr. Henderson mended his fence. A fork clinked against a plate. "Oh? He's a good neighbor, isn't he? Always ready to lend a hand." Eleanor's gaze intensified, a question suspended in the air. "He seems quite attentive to the neighborhood." The subtle insinuation landed like a physical blow. A flush crept up Sarah's neck. Her mother wasn't just making small talk, she was probing. Eleanor knew. Or suspected. The casual dalliance, the stolen glances, the charged stillness across the fence, it hadn't been as private as Sarah had believed. "He's just being friendly, Mom," Sarah mumbled, pushing her plate away. The lasagna, usually a comfort, now felt heavy and indigestible. The giddy excitement that had buoyed her all summer was supplanted by a growing dread. The unspoken judgments were no longer just a feeling, they were real, threatening to unravel the carefully constructed fantasy she had nurtured. The light flirtation carried repercussions, and they were already beginning to encircle her. A hurtful distance. The scent of freshly cut grass, usually a comforting aroma, now clung to Sarah with an almost cloying sweetness. She watched him, the careful precision of his movements as he adjusted the new fence panel, the way the late afternoon sun glinted off the worn wood of his hammer. He looked up, catching her eye. There was a flicker there, a subtle tightening around his mouth that she couldn't quite decipher. "You're still here," he stated, his voice even, devoid of the teasing lilt she'd grown accustomed to. Sarah pushed off the fence, letting her hand trail along the weathered planks. "Just admiring your handiwork. Though, I was hoping for a more personal touch." She paused, letting her eyes linger on his. You haven't been over. Not since, the other day. He set the hammer down with a deliberate thud. Sarah, we talked about this. It was a mistake. His gaze was firm, but she saw the fleeting uncertainty in his eyes, a shadow she hadn't anticipated. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. A mistake? She echoed, her voice barely a whisper. You really think so? The playful confidence she'd worn like a second skin began to fray at the edges. She'd expected resistance, a challenge even, but not this absolute retreat. He stepped closer to his side of the fence, his hands tucked into his pockets. You're 18. I'm almost 60. There's no future in it. You know that. His words were clipped, each one a stone dropped into the deepening chasm between them. Sarah felt a sudden surge of indignation. And you get to decide that for me? For us? Her voice rose, betraying the tremble in her hands. I thought you felt something too. The memory of his touch, the warmth of his hand on her arm, the way his eyes had held hers, felt like a cruel deception now. He didn't answer immediately. He looked away, his jaw tight, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant chirping of crickets. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, laced with a weariness that pierced through her anger. I do, Sarah. That's why I have to keep my distance. He turned then, walking towards his back door, leaving her standing alone by the fence, the afternoon sun now feeling like a harsh spotlight on her raw vulnerability. The easy intimacy they'd shared, the silent understanding that had blossomed over weeks of shared glances and hushed conversations, felt shattered. The fence, once a symbol of playful flirtation, now felt like an insurmountable barrier. Sarah watched his retreating figure, a hollow ache settling in her chest. His refusal, so absolute and unexpected, stung more than any outright rejection. It was the implication that he was protecting her from himself that truly twisted the knife. She'd wanted passion, a daring defiance of norms. He'd offered a hurtful distance. Choosing connection. The rhythmic thud of a hammer punctuated the lazy afternoon. Sarah lounged against her own fence, observing her 59-year-old neighbor mend a wobbly panel next door. His sleeves were rolled, his entire attention absorbed by the task. When he finally registered her presence, a polite nod sufficed. But Sarah held her ground, a playful smirk curving her lips. Look sturdy, she called, her voice carrying easily. Since I just turned 18, maybe you could tackle mine next? The hammer froze mid-swing, his eyes locking with hers across the weathered barrier. The silence that followed felt thicker than the summer air, charged with a flirtatious current that elevated the simple backyard into a pivotal stage. After a beat that felt both infinite and fleeting, a faint smile softened the corners of his mouth. 18, you say? He mused, his voice a low, gravelly sound. Congratulations. And your fence appears perfectly sound, Sarah. A girl can dream, she countered, pushing off the fence to take a few steps toward the small gate separating their properties. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it, the threshold she'd been circling for weeks. Or she can ask for assistance. He lowered his hammer slowly, deliberately, the soft clink of metal against wood echoing in the sudden hush. He swiped a hand across his brow, his gaze unwavering. What kind of assistance are you seeking, Sarah? The directness of his question jolted her, a sharp tremor. Her bravado, which she'd worn like a protective cloak, threatened to unravel. Then, a spark of resolve rekindled within her. Company, for starters, she admitted, her voice softer now, tinged with vulnerability. I'm tired of being alone. The confession hung in the air, a raw, unvarnished truth. He looked at her, truly saw her, and the warmth in his eyes was nearly overwhelming. It was a gaze that acknowledged her not just as a young woman, but as a person grappling with desires and solitude. You're not alone, Sarah, he said gently. You have me. Her breath hitched. The unspoken implication, clear as day, sent a shiver tracing her spine. Do I? She whispered, inching closer to the gate, her fingertips grazing the aged timber. He moved then, pushing the gate open just enough for her to slip through. The aroma of sawdust mingled with his subtle, earthy cologne as she stepped onto his lawn. The grass felt softer beneath her bare feet here, the air thick with an unspoken promise. He didn't touch her, yet his presence was a palpable force, a comforting weight. "You do," he confirmed, his voice barely audible. He reached out, not for her, but to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was feather-light, fleeting, yet it sent a tremor through her. "But the kind of help you're asking for, Sarah, it's a significant choice. For both of us." She met his gaze, her own eyes wide and unblinking. "I know," she said, her voice firm despite her racing pulse. "And I'm choosing connection. With you. A shared life story." The hammer clattered onto the grass beside him, its metallic thud echoing in the sudden quiet. He straightened slowly, his gaze still fixed on Sarah. A faint smile touched his lips, a different kind of smile than the polite nod before. 18, huh, he mused, his voice a low rumble. Time flies. He picked up the hammer, but made no move to resume his work. Instead, he walked to the fence, stopping just a few feet from where she stood. The air between them hummed with an unspoken energy, a current that had nothing to do with hammers or fences. "So, you're finally an adult," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Any grand plans for this newfound freedom?" Sarah pushed off the fence, a playful glint in her eyes. "Oh, you know," she said, stepping closer. "The usual. World domination, maybe a few late-night escapades." She paused, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "And definitely getting a proper fence around here. This one looks like it's seen better decades." She gestured vaguely at her own weathered pickets. He chuckled, a rich, warm sound. "A proper fence, you say? What exactly does a proper fence entail for a world dominator?" "Well, for starters," she began, her gaze holding his, "it needs to be sturdy. Something that can withstand a sudden gust of wind. And it needs to be tall enough to offer some privacy. You know, for all those top-secret meetings." She winked. He leaned against the fence, mirroring her earlier pose. "I think I might be able to help with that," he said, his voice laced with an amusement that made her stomach flutter. "I've built a few fences in my time. Even some that could withstand a metaphorical hurricane or two." Their conversation meandered through the afternoon, topics shifting like summer clouds. They talked about his work as a carpenter, the projects he'd tackled over the years, the satisfaction of creating something tangible. Sarah shared her aspirations for college, her dreams of studying architecture, of designing spaces that felt both grand and intimate. He listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face, offering insights and encouragement. The initial flirty tension softened into something warmer, a comfortable ease that surprised them both. It was as if a hidden door had opened between their two worlds, revealing a shared landscape of ambition and quiet yearning. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across their yards, Sarah's mother called her in for dinner. Sarah felt a pang of disappointment, a reluctance to break the spell. "Well," she said, pushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "It was enlightening." He smiled, a genuine, open smile that made his eyes sparkle. "Indeed. Perhaps we can continue this discussion of fence architecture and world domination sometime soon?" "Perhaps," she replied, a thrill running through her. She turned to go, then looked back. "And about that fence, you really don't have to." He just winked. "Don't I?" Beyond friendship. The scent of sawdust hung faintly in the air, a counterpoint to the blooming petunias in Sarah's window boxes. Her smirk didn't waver, even as the neighbor's hand, calloused and strong, slowly lowered the hammer. His gaze, usually so open and friendly, held a new, unreadable depth. A beat passed, then another, the quiet hum of the cicadas filling the space between them. 18, you say?" he finally rumbled, his voice a little lower than usual. He wiped a stray lock of graying hair from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Quite the milestone. It is, Sarah agreed, pushing off the fence and taking a step closer, her bare arm brushing against the rough wood. The sun caught the glint of amusement in her eyes. Means I'm officially an adult. Old enough to make my own decisions. He watched her, a slow smile spreading across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. And what decisions might those be, Sarah? Well, for one, she began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, I've decided this fence needs some serious attention. And I think you're just the man for the job. She let her eyes drift over his muscular arms, still dusted with sawdust, before meeting his gaze again. The air thrummed with unspoken things, a delicate balance of playful challenge and something deeper, more potent. He chuckled, a low, rich sound that seemed to vibrate through the afternoon stillness. Is that so? And what makes you think I'm available for such a demanding task? Oh, I have a feeling you might be persuaded, she countered, her voice laced with a knowing confidence that surprised even herself. She felt a thrill, a delicious shiver of anticipation, as she pushed the boundary, testing the waters of their long-standing acquaintance. This wasn't the neighbor she'd known her whole life, the one who offered kind advice and helped with heavy lifting. This was different. He stepped away from the fence, gathering his tools with deliberate movements, but his eyes never left hers. Perhaps, he murmured, a shadow of an unspoken thought passing across his face. Perhaps I could be. He swung the hammer onto his belt loop, the metallic clang sharp in the sudden quiet. But perhaps, a conversation about such serious matters requires a more private setting. And perhaps a cold drink. Sarah's heart gave a little leap. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you come over, he finished, his voice firm but inviting, and we can discuss the structural integrity of fences, and other things, over a glass of iced tea. Or something stronger, now that you're 18. His lips curved into a subtle, intriguing smile. A blush rose to Sarah's cheeks, a warmth spreading through her. I'd like that, she said, her voice softer now, losing some of its earlier bravado. This was it. The moment she'd been hinting at, fantasizing about, since the first flicker of attraction had sparked between them weeks ago. Stepping through the gate, onto his property, felt like crossing a threshold into an entirely new chapter. The scent of his aftershave, faint but distinct, mingled with the sawdust, creating a heady mix that promised something far beyond friendship.